Recently, I had the pleasure of talking to a legend in the world of the English language, David Crystal. He is a linguist, a lecturer, a broadcaster, and he has written or edited over 100 books about language, including the Cambridge Encyclopedia of the English language. We talked about language change, the myth of the native speaker, and why learning a language is part of being human. This is an edited version of our interview. If you would like to listen to the full version, you will find a link down in the description box. I hope you enjoy it. As a teacher of English as a foreign language, a lot of learners encounter teachers who talk about kind of standard English. And I wondered how you feel about this idea of a kind of standard English.
Well, the notion of standard English historically, of course, is a written English and effectively a printed English. It's the kind of English that everybody used when the language was written down. And even at the beginning, when it standardized, it took 400 years for English to standardize. The movement started around about 1400. And it was really more or less sorted out by 1800. Dr. Johnson, in his dictionary, for instance, represents a very clear picture of how English vocabulary and so on was standardizing in his day. But ironically, just at the point at which English was settling down into a standard form in Britain, it was beginning to diversify because American English was starting across the pond with Noah Webster and the new nation. And round by 1800, of course, American English existed as a different standard, as an emerging standard, differently from British English. And then later, other educated standards emerged in the written language around the world. So one can talk sensibly about, Australian English and so on very, very effectively. Not that the differences are very great. We're still only talking about 2 or 3% of the language being different between British English and American English. Is not a big deal, but it's enough to express the different identities of these different countries. So standard English is alive and well, despite the fact that there's a certain amount of variation in it. And when people speak standard English, or try to, they might learn it in school, or you certainly learn it as a foreign language, then once again, you get a general consensus that there are certain features of the English sound system that everybody uses, otherwise you're going to be unintelligible. And then you're going to get this few percent of differences, like, you might say bath or bath in this country, but it'll be bath in America, that kind of small difference, which doesn't usually amount to unintelligibility, but it's certainly there. So standard English is certainly there, despite the fact that there's a certain amount of variation in it. So the next question is, why have a standard language? And the answer to that is to promote intelligibility, both nationally and internationally. It helps us understand each other. And that's one of the two big forces that are driving language. The other big force, as we mentioned earlier, really, is the need for identity. I have to say who I am and where I'm from. And that produces local accents and dialects, both nationally and internationally. So it's the tension now between these two forces, intelligibility saying, let's all speak the same, and identity saying, no, let's be different. And it's that kind of tension that is causing, teachers, I imagine, in various parts of the world, a bit of confusion. Which force do I allow into my classroom?
Well, I think maybe, the reason I ask, I suppose, is because of this general kind of obsession in the world of foreign language teaching with everything you do should be modeled on the kind of native speaker. Like a native speaker accent, native speaker grammar, and
that's history for me. Yeah, that has gone out of the window with the dodo. I mean, I know there are people around the world who will still maintain it, but it's a myth. There was never a native speaker in the sense of somebody who hasn't been influenced by some sort of local variation here and there. all sorts of mixed accents, people, especially these days, people moving about the country and accommodating to the accent of the place in which they find themselves. All this kind of variation is there. Remember that RP was only ever spoken by about, most in its history, 5% of the speakers of England. Remember, not Wales or Scotland or Ireland. And these days, it's probably around about 2% of the population. And even RP, of course, has changed its character. So it's no longer the very, very posh, far back kind of accent that we heard, a few decades ago. But go around the English-speaking world now and look at the majority of speakers who are out there and try listening for RP and see how often you find it. You can stand at the corner of Oxford Street, and I did this once for a BBC programme and made notes about the accents I heard as I passed by. I could wait for ages. It's like London buses, before one turns up, before an RP accent turned up. And when one does turn up, my wife Hilary and I often turn to each other and say, "Hey, RP lives." And we're so pleased to hear it, because it's so rare. So what are we preparing our students for? In terms of listening comprehension, they have got to be made aware of the fact that English is now multiple in its accent. I'm talking about educated English now. I'm not talking about, people who don't have an educated background, people you want to identify with as a learner, and mixed accents and modified RP accents and all sorts of things, American tinged accents and accents themselves, of course. All of these things are now absolutely the norm. So from a comprehension point of view, you've got to introduce students to this kind of variation. Otherwise, they're going to be living in a fool's paradise. From a production point of view, of course, nothing necessarily changes. If you're used to teaching RP and all your materials are in RP and that's been your life, then by all means teach RP to a student to produce. It's a perfectly reasonable accent, just because it happens to be not so common as it used to be doesn't mean to say it's not got a value. It still has, and it'll still be heard, especially on the radio. So there's a difference here, I think, between production and comprehension.
Just to rewind just very slightly, because I know that there are some teachers out there who feel like, and I'm not one of them, but they feel like, well, we need to have this native speaker model, because if we don't have this, perfect sort of accent and the grammar like native speakers, then what we will do is we will allow chaos.
Chaos will not happen if the teaching has been good. I mean, one aims for intelligibility always. The question then is, does a local accent interfere with intelligibility? And if it does, then the student has not yet learnt the English language and the teaching has gone horribly wrong somewhere. But let's assume now that we've got somebody who is pretty fluent in English, but has got a pretty strong accent, a Spanish accent, Portuguese accent, French accent, or whatever. As long as that person is intelligible to me, I have no problem with that whatsoever. In fact, the intelligibility drive is present. So now it's the identity drive that I'm fascinated by. I love to hear English spoken with a Spanish accent, or accents, because of course the variety of Spanish accents is really quite extraordinary, especially in South America. I love to hear English spoken with a French accent. Why? But not just because it's delightful, but because it helps me identify who the speaker is. They are French. Fine. Well, that's what I need to know in order to develop a kind of sense of balance between us in having a conversation. In my view, there's only one type of person who needs to speak RP perfectly like a native speaker so that they cannot be identified as a foreigner, and they are spies. I imagine to be a spy, you would probably need to have that kind of disappearing act in your accent. But apart from them, I don't see any reason whatsoever to aim to become identical to a native speaker. They are not, learners are not native speakers. They are foreigners, and I'm the same. If I am learning French or Spanish or whatever language I've learnt over the years, then so long as I'm intelligible, I don't want to be a French person or a Spanish person. I want to be me, and I want my accent to reflect that and to let other people know it. And so that kind of climate of increasing acceptance, tolerance, and increasingly respect for different accents, I think it's becoming increasingly the norm, though recognizing that there's still a great deal of conservatism out there.
No, I mean, look, I totally agree, but I also know that there are teachers out there who are saying, well, we can't just have people speaking with Spanish or French accents because, we need. It's that whole kind of, for me, it's a very almost colonialism kind of attitude about, homogenizing the language and the people who speak it.
Yeah, people have to realize that there is no such thing as homogeneity in language. There is always variation. And as long as the variation doesn't get in the way of intelligibility, then it has to be respected first and then fostered, really, because these are markers of identity. And, the difference between intelligibility and identity is not just an intellectual difference. Intelligibility is for the head. Identity is for the heart. Who you are, which community you belong to, which community you're proud to belong to. You want to foster that at the same time, of course, as needing to be understood and understand other people who belong to the same language community. Now, the really disastrous thing in the attitude that you've mentioned is that in many language teaching schools around the world, I understand, if you're a native speaker of a language, you get paid more. And if you're a non-native speaker of the language, even though the non-native speaker of the language may know more about the English language than the native speaker does. And if you ask me who I want to be taught by, do I want to be taught by a native speaker who doesn't know one end of grammar from the other, or by a non-native speaker who is very familiar with English grammar and knows how to teach it? I know who I'm voting for every time.
My experience again is with a lot of foreign learners and learning a language, any language, is really, really difficult, and it takes a really long time. In fact, I believe you've described learning a language as like climbing a mountain.
Well, let me first of all say that the metaphor of the mountain, when I used it, I talked about vocabulary being the Everest of language. It was vocabulary I was thinking of more than anything else, not pronunciation, not grammar. Those aren't mountains, really, When you think about it, if you're learning English, there are, depending on the accent, 40, 44 sounds that you have to learn. Well, that's not a big deal, really. It might take you a while to get your tongue around them, but, anybody can handle that number of sounds within a reasonably short period of time. When you get onto grammar, leaving aside some of the most sophisticated forms of grammar you might get in literary expression or very advanced scientific language or what have you, we're only talking about what, I did the index to the big quirk grammar, the comprehensive grammar of the English language. When you count up all the points about grammar that are in that big book, there are about 3,500 of them. So that might seem like a lot to a beginner, but come on, 3,500 points, you can handle that over a period of 4 or 5 years or something, and most of them you'll get in the first year. But vocabulary, wow. Now we are talking about an Everest, because how many words are there in the English language? Well, nobody knows, but at least 1 million, probably far more than that. And your competent average native speaker adult will have a vocabulary of about 50, 60,000 words, something of that order of magnitude. Well, that is a task. And I remember very well from my own learning of foreign languages, I could handle the pronunciation and the grammar to a reasonable extent quite quickly. But the vocabulary, that is the killer. How do you get all that under your belt? And that, to my mind, is the biggest problem when people get to that intermediate stage. They can do conversations now very well. They've got a pretty solid command of grammar. They've got the pronunciation pretty well. They can even probably write it and spell it reasonably well too. Who knows? But the vocabulary, you just think, oh no, I just don't know these words that are coming up, and that can be the slippery slope into depression, it seems to me. And so now here's the interesting point, Christian. At least it seems to me so. What we need now is good techniques for teaching vocabulary. And where are they? Where are the good vocabulary teaching materials? Piles of grammar teaching materials all over the place, pronunciation materials everywhere. But vocabulary often still, I observe in classrooms or read new textbooks, and the chapter by chapter organization is, to do with a grammatical point. And at the end, it says, here's the vocabulary you need in order to understand this chapter. Learn that off by heart, and you sort of learn this set of words that turned up in the chapter. There's no structural approach to vocabulary. A kind of semantic structural approach is very definitely needed. Now, I do see some signs of this happening at an academic level and in applied linguistics. But when you get down to the classroom, you tell me, is there a good structured vocabulary graded thing that would take you all the way through for that intermediate period? I don't know of one.
What would you say to people who really want to learn a language but they're lacking motivation? Like what is like a really great reason or some great reasons to learn a language?
Well, a whole cluster of things, I suppose. The fact that we are living in a multilingual and multicultural world. Why climb mountains? Because they're there, and these languages are there. So if you're curious about the nature of the planet and what it means to be human, then you've got to very quickly start addressing the question of why are all these differences there? It's a matter of temperament, partly. Some people are only interested in similarities, but I, for one, and I think perhaps I'm in the majority, are interested in differences. I don't want to spend my whole life just talking to the people I know who have exactly the same background as me. I want to find out about the diversity that really will give me an insight on what it means to be human. There are something like 6,000 languages in the world. I'd love to study all of them, because each one has an individual insight into the nature of the human condition that no other language has got. And the more I learn another language, not to fluency level necessarily, mind, just enough to get a sense of what it's like, what it's about, how the people think in it, and so on, then this illuminates me and my language more than anything else. So there's all those theoretical sort of reasons. And then there are the practical reasons, of course. So I'm trying to sell you some goods, and I know your language, or at least a bit. Aren't you going to buy from me because I know your language? Whereas if I say, I want to sell you some goods, but you've got to learn English, mate. Sorry, I just can't be bothered to learn your language. You're going to buy my goods now? All that sort of economic kind of argument is increasingly important in this day and age. They're just two of the reasons. There are a host of other reasons as well. What people need is the two crucial things: motivation, which I've been talking about, but the other big factor is opportunity, and that is much trickier. And by opportunity, I mean, it's got to be there in the educational system. It's got to be there in the cultural system. Far more people would be learning foreign languages in this country, and I guess it's the same in many others, if foreign language learning was given the national respect that it needs. And by national respect, I mean things like prizes. If you're a physicist, you want the Nobel Prize, don't you? If you're a literature person, you want the Nobel Prize. Why is there no Nobel Prize for languages? Why are there no internationally recognized prizes at that level? There's a Templeton Prize for Progress in Religion. Why isn't there a Templeton type prize for progress in languages? Why have languages been left off the agenda here? Why did Nobel ignore languages so much? This puzzles me greatly. And it seems to me that if we could build into our international society criteria like that, prizes, language days. There are some of those. We do have some international language days, Mother Tongue Language Day, for example. But even so, Lingua Pax has a little prize, for instance. There are a few things around, but nothing major. And that's the sort of perspective within which people would say, oh, learning a language is not just useful for me because I might sell some goods, and not just useful for me because I might learn something about other languages which will illuminate me. No, it's because language learning is valued by society at an international level. It's starting to happen at an endangered language level. People are realizing that of those 6,000 languages, half of them are so seriously endangered, they're going to die out in the course of the present century. And this is beginning to worry people, and people are starting to do something about it. But I'm not just talking about endangered languages here. I'm talking about all the languages of the world. It's that kind of international value we need to see present. And we're still a long way off from that. So that would help enormously, I think.
Again, thank you very much for your time. I really appreciate it.
Well, it's a pleasure. All power to you.
I've been busy filling up pages. I've been busy filling